Betty Carlson did more than expected to aid her country in a time of war. She moved to California at the start of the war to train for nursing during the day, while she riveted and welded fighter jets at night. And most importantly, Betty lent support to those around her, despite having a hectic life of her own to handle. But her many great qualities didn't disappear after the war was won. Her enormous heart, appreciated generosity, and hard-working spirit still remain with her to this day.
But a funny thing happened years later when I went out to bring a cake to some people who were doing Washington Park, and they were going to build a little park for the kids to play in out here in Rockford. I brought my cake, and a man came up and asked me, and he said, he says, we need somebody to drill out here. He says, I can't do this job alone unless somebody drills. Otherwise, I'm going home, which meant the work wouldn't be done for the playground. And I said, well, what are you doing? And he says, well, do you want to come and see? And I said, sure. Now, this is years later. I am out there, and I am drilling, and he is putting the bolts in and so forth, and screwing it up tight. And he says, where did you learn to drill like that? And I said I'd been a riveter and a welder and so forth, and I'd made a lot of mistakes riveting, so you had to drill them out. And he says, you should work at Chrysler. You could earn a fortune. But you never know what you do in your younger years, how it follows you through later on.
Betty Carlson grew up as a first-generation Swedish American in a country that would soon be turned into a whirlwind of long work hours and constant fear of losing loved ones overseas.
I went out to California, and I lived with my sister. She worked at an explosion plant, and then I worked as a riveter and a welder for the P-61. That's the Black Widow plane that they were just experimenting on.
Towards the end of World War II, more specifically 1943, Northrop Aircraft Incorporated produced one of the biggest game changers of the war, the P-61 Black Widow. Even though only about 700 were made, they dominated the playing field in the Pacific. The P-61 Black Widow was the first U.S. aircraft made to fly in horrible weather conditions and used as one of the most advanced night fighters of its time. Their newly made radars, mounted on the nose of the plane, made it possible to locate and destroy enemy aircraft in complete and total darkness. It was equipped with 4 50 caliber machine guns in the turret and 4 20mm cannons. The crew consisted of the pilot, the gunner, and a radar observer who doubled as a secondary gunner if needed. During the night, at speeds of up to 425 miles per hour, this 35,588-pound night fighter took out 127 enemy aircraft and 18 V-1 buzz bombs. Hitler's advance into England caused the United States to feel pressured into creating a new and improved war machine. Thus, the P-61 Black Widow was created. The Black Widow was used in the Europe Theater, China-Burma-India Theater, and the Pacific Theater. They were used in London to obliterate Adolf Hitler's revenge weapons, made for the sole purpose of causing terror, the Fiesler V-1 buzz bomb. These unguided rockets were launched from within enemy lines in Germany, all the way across the North Sea towards their intended targets in England. Over the Pacific, P-61 Black Widows made their claim to fame. They were sent out in large numbers and made their presence known throughout the Pacific. They destroyed Japanese fighter jets and bombers with little to no difficulty. The P-61 was credited with the last Allied air kill during World War II, but it was never officiated. All in all, the P-61 Black Widow was a leading force in air warfare during World War II.
I worked on the what they called the cowlings, and those are the big round parts that cover, where the propellers were at that time.
Riveting is the assembling of warplanes by joining together the numerous metal pieces of the aircraft. The women worked in pairs. One shot the rivets while the other one bucked or flattened the protruding rivet on the other side of the piece of metal. These teams worked by the thousands in factories all over the country. Since the women are now the majority of the workforce, these jobs now fell upon them to be completed with speed and accuracy. Most of the welding was done on cowlings, which were removable metal coverings or encasements on an aircraft's engine.
And then I also worked on the part that drops down, when they're going to land. I can't think of the name of it right now. And those I riveted, but on the cowlings it was the welding. And it was interesting because when I worked there, my sister, I have 2 sisters out there, and my one sister would pick me up, and we would work from about 3 or 4 in the afternoon until till midnight. and she would rivet, and so would I. And that was at a time when you used a riveting gun, which, you know, I don't know if you've ever seen one, because now they all come down in one big splash and rivet many rivets all at one time. But you would have round heads or you would have the flush heads, and you put the gun, and it's connected to a hose, which gives the air, and it goes and into the side. And on the other side of the metal of this sledge, and these were huge because the P-61 was one of the larger nighttime fighter black planes that they only used at nighttime. But anyway, you would have to take as the rivet was coming through, and I don't know if you've ever seen a rivet, but they're very short, and some of them have little round heads, or else some of them have flush heads. And it depends upon the gun that you're using, if it's fitted for a rivet with flush or a round head. But on the other side, a person had to do what they call bucket. And so you had this, it was like a big, huge metal bar, and you put it up against the rivet, and you go, and the other guy would hold it and smash it. So that would make it like it was just smashed together and keep the two pieces of metal together. And if it was all right, you give 2 taps, okay, and we go on to the next one. And if it wasn't okay, then you had to drill it out. It meant you picked up a drill and you drilled it out, and you had to replace it. And I think the conscientious people who I worked with, there was no question. You drilled it out and you did it all over again, because you knew that somebody's life depended upon this.
Besides becoming a Rosie and building fighter jets, the most important thing Betty and others like her did was believe in her country and what it stood for in a time where every ounce of support was needed. But for Betty, there was no regret, no objection, and certainly no doubt about it. It was her God-given duty to help her country in one of its greatest moments of need. From training to be a nurse during the day to riveting P-61 Black Widows at night, Betty did everything she could to support her country and the brave men and women fighting for it. Riveting and welding were 2 of the most crucial jobs in the defense industries, even though at the time Betty didn't think much about it. It was just a job to her, and only later did she realize just how important her role really was. The Great Depression started out as a normal recession, but quickly turned into much worse when the spending decreased and stock prices continued to rise. On October 24, 1929, the stock market crashed as investors desperately tried selling their shares to avoid the forthcoming events. Millions lost everything they had ever invested on that Black Thursday. The decrease of spending also resulted in a decrease in factory production and the loss of jobs all over the country. An estimated 13 to 15 million people were unemployed after the market crash, and things only began looking up when World War II started. Breadlines, soup kitchens, and a vast amount of homeless people were a more common sight in America, caused by the inability of farmers to harvest their crops. The farmers had already been struggling with economic issues and drought, so they simply couldn't afford to harvest what little crops they had. In 1930, the banking epidemics began due to the lack of trust that people had with their banks. After the crash, Americans became weary of saving their money in banks and decided to stash them in hidden places on their property. The banks were then forced to liquidate loans, and within 3 years, thousands of banks had shut down and closed their doors for good.
About 6 years old, just starting first grade. I remembered that my parents had to work full time, so that we at home, the boys and girls, my sisters and brothers and I, were more or less had to shift for ourselves and take care of one another, because work was very important, and you took whatever jobs you could. My mother was a cook, and my father was a carpenter, and my sisters and brothers worked right along too, because it wasn't easy to get the food, but it was at a time when everybody helped one another. And since my mother was a cook in a restaurant, my brothers and I would run home from White School here in Rockford, and whoever got to the restaurant first got to sit on a stool, because there was only one stool in the kitchen, and we got a nice hot meal. So that was our hot meal for the day. And then whatever food was left over that she could bring home, she brought home for us. And we got along mostly because people helped one another.
Hard time for everyone, but the strength of caring neighbors and friends brought everyone together to make the most of the horrid situation. Like Betty, others felt the compassion and strength in numbers from loved ones and neighbors around them.
Well, I think it affected all of us because we certainly never received new clothes unless we were being baptized or confirmed or starting, something. Otherwise, we wore each other's clothes. You just passed them on down the line. And shoes, sometimes they fit and sometimes they didn't, but you just wore 2 pairs of socks until they started to fit. And so it was in sharing and in helping one another. I mean, you didn't get new clothes at the drop of a hat. So we were kind of all in the same boat. I don't remember any wealthy children that had everything. We were all struggling. Well, I guess when I was younger, like when I was in grade school, you didn't think much about being depression because nobody had anything. But I can remember I had the neighbor next door, my friend, and I would go to the grocery store, and they used to have candy called Guess What's, or it was a little 2 candy kisses, and then there would be a little toy inside of it. And we never had the pennies for that. So we would push my little brother, my younger brother, dress him up and put him in a wagon, pull him to the grocery store, and then we would sing. And then the grocery man, after we put on our act, then he would give us 1 piece of this little, it was wrapped in paper, and we each got a candy kiss, and we gave the toy to the baby.
With the onset of World War II, the food rationing system was brought into effect in the spring of 1942. Rationing allowed the government to control the supply and demand of food. It was implemented to prevent public outrage and riots concerning the amount of food and other material goods that the United States had a wartime shortage of. This allowed the opportunities for the rich and the poor to be in an equal playing field so as not to cause even more problems amongst the social classes.
There were so many of us, we each got a ration book.
Ration books were given to each individual and included their full name, age, gender, height, weight, and other specific details to prevent the illegal selling of ration books to others for a profit. Each person had 48 ration points per month and could not exceed that limit or the ration goods would not be provided for them. Ration books contained the blue stamp and red stamp rationing. Meats, butter, fats, and oils were rationed. Sugar was the first food to be rationed in the spring of 1942. The war caused sugar importation from the Philippines to halt, while the Hawaiian ships were rerouted for military purposes. The supply of sugar in the United States was quickly diminished by 1/3 of the usual amount, which resulted in the production of War Ration Book 1, which contained stamps for purchasing sugar. The sugar rationing eventually ended in 1947 at the end of the war.
And the main problem we had was with sugar, because being Swedish, we did a lot of baking when we could, and sugar was rationed, and coffee and some of the other things, and you had to bring your stamps, and sometimes we'd forget them because we had to go and run to the store. If you forgot, you had to run back and get the ration book so that you could get your sugar or your coffee or whatever you wanted, and gasoline too was rationed.
If you're one of the fortunate ones, however, neighbors and friends were always there to help you out if you needed something. In the end, you were never alone in your struggles.
If you knew somebody who needed a job and you knew there was an opening, you told them about it so that they could go out and try and get that job. And if you needed food, you didn't hesitate to go to your neighbors and say, hey, I need a little bit of sugar, or I need a little bit of flour, I'm doing this, or do you have a couple extra potatoes? And if they had it, they would give it to you. At least the neighbors that we had, and we did likewise to them when they ran short. If we had it, we just interchanged. And most of the neighbors that we had were very, very friendly and very helpful in this way. We lived in a neighborhood where we were all in the same boat. Nobody had any money and jobs were poor, but we all clung together and helped one another. And I think this is something that we have to remember now about helping one another.
The new rationing system boosted employment across the United States. Individuals' efforts to help during the war ranged from recycling and scrap drives and monetary donations to working in factories to produce war materials. Much of the United States' supply of rubber came from Southeast Asia. When the Japanese took control of that area in 1942, new means of receiving rubber were needed. As a response to Japanese occupation, scrap drives were held to collect rubber through donating old tires, rubber shoes, gloves, raincoats, and gardening hoses. Scrap metal was also in high demand to aid in the production of tanks, ships, planes, and weapons that were a necessity during times of war. In addition to scrap drives, war bonds were a must in helping out the war effort on the home front. Victory gardens were also a popular way to help soldiers fighting in the war. Victory gardens allowed people to bypass the rationing system, but also produce and collect food to send overseas to U.S. soldiers. About 20 million Americans took part in planting these gardens and canned any excess fruits and vegetables to sustain themselves. Rationing was a great concept, but had one downfall: the infamous black market. Meat, sugar, and gasoline were often sold for much higher prices than bought illegally on the black market. But even through these difficult times, most Americans found it in their hearts to be true to their country and what it stood for. You stuck together no matter what.
No, we just had 2 neighborhood groceries. And at that time, because you didn't have any money and you were going from paycheck to paycheck, you charged your groceries. And then when the paycheck came in at the end of the week or the end of 2 weeks or a month, then you paid off your grocery bill and then you started in again, just to make things last. And the grocery man knew that you were good for it, so he would kind of carry you through. And I don't know how he ever made a living off of any of us.
Camp Grant was an Army-operated military facility located in southern Rockford, Illinois. The camp was built in 1917 and used by the National Guard until 1935, and later rehabilitated in late 1940 at the beginning stages of America's involvement in World War II, but was shut down in the late 40s after the war.
When I was a junior in high school, I just barely reached 15 and a half. At that time, the war had gone on, and and my brothers had left home, and we lived in a big house. She rented rooms out, to people who wanted to come for maybe a day or a weekend or a week if they came to visit somebody at Camp Grant. And then we had one man who came, and his son was at Camp Grant, and he wanted to be near him. So he lived with us for a while, and he was a very handy man. But he said, I think I can get you a job. And I thought it was great because I caught the bus down where the old post office is, down on South Main Street, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then I would ride it all the way out to Camp Grant and get checked out to see if I was legal to go through. And then I was in Tent City, and so this is where most of the tents were and so forth. They had in the summertime for a short time. And I worked in the Post Exchange there at selling ice cream. They put me in the ice cream bar because I didn't know too much about jewelry. And I was too young to serve at the bar, except a couple of nights they were very short of help. And so I was serving some of the beer and the liquor then, but not just for a short time, only in an emergency. Otherwise, it was just making malts for the soldiers that came.
Post exchanges on the base acted like county stores or local drugstores. Not only were their needs taken care of, but they could also catch up with their friends and spend downtime chatting with other soldiers stationed there.
And I worked in the Post Exchange there at selling ice cream. They put me in the ice cream bar because I didn't know too much about jewelry. And I was too young to serve at the bar, except a couple of nights they were very short of help. And so I was serving some of the beer and the liquor then, but not just for a short time, only in an emergency. Otherwise, it was just making malts for the soldiers that came.
During World War II, Camp Grant was converted into an induction center for soldiers, where mostly physical training and medical exams took place, although some men underwent basic training also. As well as training, the camp served as a reception center for new recruits and returning soldiers to the area.
As you rode the bus through, you saw you saw Camp Grant, and you saw the soldiers, and you would see the new ones that were coming into camp, and they would, on a hot summer day, you'd see them dressed in a raincoat, and they were going for their physicals, to get checked out before they were going to be shipped out, and or they were getting some of their medical treatments and so on. I usually found out where they came from and what their life was like and where they were going and what they were doing. I'm very inquisitive, so I'd ask all of these things, but I can't remember anything special. They were all very friendly, and I thought it was a very exciting time because you met all sorts of people from all over the United States, and I hadn't traveled a lot, so it was kind of fun to hear somebody from the South come up and talk a little different, or some New Yorker come in and so on. And I learned a great deal from the different personalities too, as to what they were like, and when they ordered their milkshake or ice cream cone or whatever.
Soldiers were entertained by the numerous recreational facilities dispersed throughout the camp. These facilities included a theater, a PX, and a variety of clubs that were frequented by the Camp Grant goers.
At that time in Rockford, they also had what they called the USO, where people could go down, and a lot of the young girls would go down and meet soldiers there, and sometimes later on they kept in touch with them and got married. There was a lot of wooden buildings, barracks, that they had, and it was very well kept. It was a nice, clean camp, and we weren't allowed to go out and mingle in the camp. All we did was we came in and the bus dropped you off, right to the PX and so forth, and you walked in and that was it. Really never saw much Camp Grant except of the buildings and then the soldiers, and they would always march in, platoons or, in groups of men together, and you could hear this, the hut, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, and that was about it. It was just kind of an exciting time because it was totally different from being here in the city. But I really can't say. They did have some German prisoners there out in Camp Grant that you had to be wary of, but we never had anything to do with them either.
165 of its vast number of buildings were barracks for the men staying at the camp. Each training company stationed at Camp Grant was assigned 4 semi-permanent barracks, which housed about 63 men in each. In addition to the barracks, the companies also had access to 1 mess hall and 1 administration building, all of which were clumped together so commanders could easily keep an eye on their troops during their stay. Although Camp Grant was not the only major base in the country, it still served as an important base during World War II.
I think it was my early bringing up that I always wanted to help somebody, and I feel that I could really help someone only if I knew how. And so I had watched my mother, and I'd watched neighbors, take care of people who fell down and couldn't afford to go to the doctor and bandage a knee or strap up an ankle or something if you had it. And I just admired them, and I thought, boy, I'm going to learn how to do that. And I felt such a satisfaction that I had helped somebody, because you just kind of wanted to pass it on. Somebody had helped you as a youngster, and what can you do to continue to make this a better world? And this was instilled in each one of us.
Betty has always had the desire to help others in need and provide care for those who didn't have access to it. To make her lifelong dream a reality, she decided to join the Cadet Nursing program and attend the training when she wasn't working in the factory. To qualify, the women were required to be between 17 and 35, a high school graduate or a college student, in good health and mentally alert. Cadet nurses were a part of the United States Cadet Nurse Corps, established in 1943 to ensure that an admirable amount of trained nurses would be able to take care of its citizens on the home and war fronts. Training took 30 weeks, and pre-cadets, like Betty, were only in their first 9 months of training when the war ended. During training, the nurses were required to accomplish many tasks throughout their days.
We had classes sometimes, and you had classes, if you worked from 7 to 9 maybe, then you had class from 9 till 11. At this nursing school that I attended, it was the Methodist Hospital of Southern California in Los Angeles. And it was right about 2 blocks from USC, so we had some classes, bacteriology and so forth, again affiliated there. But you would start out and you would give the patient a bath, complete bath. You took a pan of water and you washed them with soap and water and rinsed it off, and you dried them. And then when you were all through, you gave them a good back rub when you were finished. And then you changed the linens on the bed. That was in the beginning. And then later on, your duties increased to where if you had a male patient, you learned how to shave them. And then later on, you got a little bit more. You were allowed to give medicines. And then you had affiliations where you went into the delivery room and you worked for a few months, and you worked in surgery for a few months. And then you went to the Children's Hospital in Hollywood, and you learned how to take care of little children. You went to San Bernardino to learn all about communicable diseases. And you met a lot of different people there. I mean, one was, I don't know if you're too young, but Judy Garland was a patient in our psychiatric unit. And whenever she was, her private duty nurses went off for lunch or something, then we were allowed to go in and sit and help her out too. But people were all very, very nice, and you met a lot of interesting people because, like, for example, I can remember going at Children's Hospital in Hollywood. A group of us crossed the road, and here was Bob Hope, and he came in and he bought us all a hamburger. I thought that was pretty neat.
Even though the war ended before she could graduate the program, Betty continued her training and continued to help those less fortunate than her. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany officially surrendered to Great Britain. The United States dropping of the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima led Japan to surrender, ending the brutal 6-year war. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese formally surrendered. For all Allied forces, an immense joy and sense of victory were felt all around the world. People cheered and danced in the streets, threw extravagant parades, and celebrated the war finally ending.
At the end of the war, yes, it was just before I was going in nurses training. I was out in California, and everybody on the street just hooped and hollered and carried on. I mean, it was just like kind of a wild mess. Everybody was hugging one another and kissing. The war is over, the war is over. And See's Candies, which was like Fannie Mae's here, was giving out free samples and saying, you know, everybody come. I just thought it was great. It really was something, because it was a time, and a lot of people got drunk. I can remember that too, downtown in LA. But you know, it was a fun time, because I can remember in nurses training, you know, we had USOs in Los Angeles, just as we did up here in Rockford. And you know, a lot of the girls who were in nurses training, their boyfriends had gone off to war, their brothers and so forth, so we all had somebody in the war at that time. I had one brother who was in the Navy. He was out in the South Pacific. Another brother was in the Merchant Marines, and then the third one was at Camp Grant, but he wasn't soldier material. The fourth one was down at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and that hadn't returned yet. And yet we were going to have a dance, and there were no men around. I don't know if I wrote that in there or not, but at the time what we did is we went down to the USO, and we stood as nurses and said, we're having a dance tonight at the dorm, and we need some men to dance with who will come with us. And we filled a streetcar, the J car, all the way, and they came back, and we had a wonderful time. So I mean, it's sometimes you've got to improvise, and you take what you get. But it was a fun time for everybody concerned. And one girl in nurses training, when her boyfriend came back, he was in the Air Force, he brought back his parachuter, and she made a wedding gown out of it. I thought that was kind of good.
Despite the many hardships Betty Carlson and people all over the country faced during World War II, the American people remained strong and resilient. When times were tough, she aided in the production of fighter jets while training to be a nurse during her free time. It may have been difficult for most, but she never once complained. She made the best out of every situation and never failed to maintain her optimistic outlook on life. The resiliency of this country was truly admirable, and, like Betty, an inspiration to all. My hope is that one day we will have the ability to brighten people's lives like Betty has done to mine. She showed me what it meant to be a genuinely good person, putting others before yourself, sacrificing more than you thought was possible, and completely devoting yourself to the sole purpose of helping others and bettering the lives of those less fortunate. I can honestly say that I'm extremely fortunate to have been blessed with the opportunity to meet Betty and her family. They have truly changed how I perceive life and the obstacles that lay ahead. I'm proud to know someone so sincere and brave, strong and beautiful, a real hero. Betty Carlson will always hold a special place in my heart, and I hope she realizes just how much she means to my family and me. Thank you, Betty.